They say the fortress of Black Hollow was built on stone older than the kingdom itself, that its foundations reached so deep into the mountain that the earth beneath it groaned. From the valley below, it appeared as a jagged tooth of obsidian, black even in daylight, its spires knifing the sky. Few living souls had seen its interior, and fewer still had left it. The fortress was not a military bastion, nor a castle for kings. It was a place of silence and punishment, a cold maw in which the realm's most dangerous political enemies, heretics, mutineers, were swallowed whole. But the silence was not natural. It was maintained by fire, fire that never dimmed, never died, even in the wettest storms that howled against its walls. Travelers spoke of a strange orange glow from its battlements on moonless nights, as though the entire stronghold were lit from within by some monstrous hearth. The truth of that glow was whispered only among the guards and the condemned, in voices strained by fear. The flames were not fed by wood or oil, but by men, not in the crude sense of burning bodies in pyres, but in something older, more precise, more deliberate. The fortress consumed its prisoners as a lamp consumes oil slowly, in a manner that prolonged agony into weeks or months. The warden of Black Hollow, Lord Garan Vaith, was a figure of contradictions, born to a noble line, educated in the courts of scholars. He had once been praised as a man of vision, yet somewhere along his path, his fascination with punishment outgrew the law itself. He did not see incarceration as an end, but as a processor transformation of human life into something useful for the fortress and, perhaps, for himself. He kept journals filled with diagrams of lanterns and human anatomy, of bellows and veins, experimenting with ways to draw vitality from flesh. Those who knew him said he had the calm demeanor of a priest and the eyes of a man counting the hours of your life. The condemned were brought to Black Hollow in sealed wagons, their manacles biting into raw wrists. Upon arrival, they were not sent to cells, but to what the guards called the stilling hall. There, under the cold gaze of the warden, each prisoner was fitted with a harness of brass and leather that clung to the spine. From the base of the neck trailed a narrow tube, no thicker than a quill, which ran into the wall and up toward the fortress's vast torch sconces. Once connected, the device would begin its work drawing, not blood, but something finer. The warden called it the lumen, the living essence that burned hotter and longer than any oil. The prisoners felt it immediately, a draining at first, imperceptible, like fatigue after long labor, then a gnawing hollow that no food or sleep could fill. Yet they remained alive, walking, speaking, even working in the fortress's endless corridors. The harness kept them tethered to the walls, sometimes for years, their essence drawn drop by drop to feed the fortress's eternal fire. At night, their faces glowed faintly, as though a candle flickered beneath their skin. It was said that the fortress grew brighter during executions. For the warden, an execution was not a swift severing, but the final total draining of a prisoner until their body collapsed into a husk. The torches would blaze white for hours afterward, their light spilling across the valley like a cruel beacon, and those who witnessed it swore the flames seemed to twist into human shapes, screaming without sound. There were rules to this horror. The fortress could not dim. Its light was a signal to the crown that Black Hollow was secure. Should the glow falter, questions would be asked. And so Lord Garan kept his numbers precise. Never too many prisoners drained too quickly, never too few harnessed to risk the fire's strength. This meant there was a constant hunger for new captives, and in the nearby towns, people vanished for crimes they had not committed. A baker who spoke ill of the tax collector, a soldier who had returned from war with questions about his orders, a widow who refused to sell her land. But not all who entered Black Hollow were silent. Among the latest wagon load was a man named Jareth Kane, once a scribe in the royal court. His crime was treason, though he had never raised a weapon. He had written a letter that accused the crown of bargaining with foreign powers to sell its own people into bondage. The letter had been intercepted, and now Jareth found himself bound for the stilling hall. He watched the others in his wagon with careful eyes, a gaunt farmer with burns on his arms, a girl no older than 16 whose silence was absolute, and an old man who prayed under his breath. Jareth had heard rumors of Black Hollow before, but they had seemed like superstitions, fires that burned on water, prisoners turned into living candles. Yet when the wagon door opened and he saw the glow on the walls, felt the unnatural warmth spilling into the freezing air, the truth settled into his bones like lead. The fortress's gates loomed above him, their metalwork blackened not by soot, but by something that seemed to shimmer faintly when the torchlight caught it. He thought then, with the clarity of a man approaching the gallows, that there would be no justice, here only a slow and deliberate unmaking. Inside, the stilling hall was lit entirely by wall torches, each brighter than any flame he had seen. The heat was dry, almost metallic. He saw the harnesses waiting on iron hooks, their brass fittings polished, the leather worn smooth from countless bodies, and in the shadows beyond, he glimpsed the prisoners already tethered, their heads bowed, their faces pale and luminous in the unnatural light. One looked up as Jareth passed, and in his eyes was no plea for help, only the hollow resignation of one who had already been half consumed. Lord Garin emerged from a side door, his black robes edged in silver. His voice was warm, almost gentle, as he welcomed the new arrivals. "You will serve a greater purpose," he told them. "In your giving, you will ensure the light of Black Hollow never dies." Jareth said nothing, but somewhere beneath the fear rising in his throat, a seed of defiance began to take root. The fortress would take from him his strength, his life, but he swore it would not take his name, nor the truth he carried. And in the endless corridors of Black Hollow, a place where men were turned into fuel, even a seed of defiance could be dangerous. The first days in Black Hollow were a slow descent into a rhythm that was not life, but a measured decay. Jareth was fitted with the harness in silence, the leather straps biting into his shoulders, the brass collar cold as a winter coin against his neck. A guard, a hulking man with a scar across his cheek, fastened the final clasp, and Jareth felt the first delicate pull through the tube. It was subtle, almost nothing, but his body recognized the theft instantly. It was not like losing blood, but like losing the warmth in his marrow. He was assigned to the East Wing, a vaulted corridor lined with 40 other prisoners, each tethered to the wall like grotesque ornaments. The harness allowed him to move no more than 12 paces from his hook, just far enough to work at the endless tasks the warden required, polishing the blackened stones, carrying buckets of water for the guards, mending the brass fixtures that seemed to hum faintly with the passing of the stolen lumen. The constant pull at his spine became a background agony, a gnawing reminder that every breath he took was borrowed from the time he had left. At night, he would lie on the stone floor, staring at the flickering shadows the torches cast. The flames danced unnaturally, as though shaped by unseen hands. In those moments, Jareth began to suspect that the lumen did not simply burn it, changed the fire itself, gave it an intelligence, a hunger. Once, in the deep hours before dawn, he swore he saw a face in the torchlight, pale and flickering, mouthing silent words. When he blinked, it was gone. The prisoners rarely spoke. Speaking wasted strength, and the harness punished it any rapid movement. Any raised voice made the draw stronger, leaving the victim gasping, yet whispers still found their way through the darkness. Jareth learned of the full drawing, the execution by total lumen extraction, performed at the great brazier in the central hall. There, the warden would speak a benediction as the prisoner's life burned into white fire. The guards treated these ceremonies with reverence, as though they were sacred rites. There were also stories of the warden's ledger, a book in which every prisoner's essence was measured in careful columns. The lumen was weighed and valued like coin. A healthy man could burn for years. The sick and the frail were used quickly, their bodies discarded in the ash pits beneath the fortress. And there was the cruelest rumor of all that the lumen, when distilled, could be ingested, granting the drinker vitality and clarity of mind. If it was true, then the warden's eternal calm might have been purchased from the lives of hundreds. On the fourth day, Jareth was sent to clean the brazier room. It was a vast chamber, the ceiling lost in shadows, the central pit surrounded by carved steps. The brazier itself was a monstrous bowl of black metal, wide enough to drown a horse, and it burned without wood or coal. The air above it shimmered, and the light it cast was so pure it made the shadows sharp as knives. As he scrubbed the soot from the lower steps, Jareth noticed pale stains on the stone, as if something once living had left its final mark there. It was in that room he first met the girl from his wagon. She was sweeping the floor, her movements slow but precise, her face expressionless. The harness at her neck glinted faintly. He had assumed she was mute, but as he passed her, she spoke so softly he thought at first it was the whisper of the flames. "Don't look at the fire too long," she said. "It will remember you." Then she turned away before he could answer. That night, he could not sleep. Her warning gnawed at him, twisting into the fear that the fire was not merely a product of the lumen, but something older that the warden had bound to his will. Perhaps the fortress had not been built to contain prisoners, but to feed whatever burned in its heart. The following week, Jareth witnessed his first full drawing. The condemned was the old man from their wagon, now too weak to stand. Guards carried him to the brazier, his harness already glowing faintly with the strain. Lord Garin stood at the edge of the pit, his voice carrying through the hall with serene authority. "In this light," he said, "we honor the debt you owe." When the final valve on the harness was opened, the old man gasped, his body arching as the lumen poured from him in streams of orange and gold. The brazier flared, casting blinding light across the hall. The man's skin shrank against his bones, his eyes clouding, his breath vanishing into a silent scream. Within moments, nothing remained but a husk that crumbled into ash where it lay. The fire burned higher than Jareth had ever seen, and in its blaze, he saw shapes, arms reaching, mouths opening in voiceless agony, faces merging and twisting into something that was not quite human. The prisoners bowed their heads, not in respect, but to shield themselves from the light. Jareth did the same, but the image of those reaching hands burned into his mind. He knew then that this place was more than a prison, it was a machine, and every man and woman within it was a gear in its eternal turning. The girl found him again later, as they were led back to their wing. She spoke without looking at him. "My brother was drawn last winter. I still see him in the flames." He wanted to ask her name, but the guards were watching, so he only nodded, the smallest acknowledgement that he had heard her, that he understood. And deep within himself, he felt that seed of defiance stir again. It was faint, but it was their refusal to vanish quietly into the warden's ledger. He began to listen more carefully to the prisoner's whispers. There were fragments of an older story, one that said Black Hollow had once been a monastery, and that the flames in the brazier were lit by monks who sought to trap something they called the Ember Saint. Whether it was a demon, a god, or something in between, no one agreed. But if the warden's harnesses drew lumen to feed the fire, perhaps they also kept the saint alive, and if that were true, then perhaps it could die. Jareth did not yet know how, but he began to count the steps between his wing and the brazier room, to note which guards lingered and which grew lazy near the midnight hour. The fortress wanted him still and quiet, but his mind was moving now, threading questions together into dangerous possibilities, and somewhere in the depths of Black Hollow, the fire burned brighter, almost as if it had noticed. Days in Black Hollow had no real measure, only the slow bleeding of strength and the growing weight of the harness. Time was counted by the flare and gutter of the torches, each flame a reminder of someone who had burned away. Jareth had learned to keep his eyes lowered when passing them, though he could feel their heat like a living breath against his skin. Yet the girl's warning that the fire could remember had lodged itself deep in him. Sometimes, even when he avoided looking, he would sense that memory pressing back, as if the flames were peering through him, cataloguing the shape of his fear. It was during one of the endless cleaning details that he overheard the guards speaking of the warden's private stock. This was lumen drawn from prisoners of unusual vigor, stored in crystal phials that glowed faintly in the dark. The warden, they said, drank it during the winter fevers, and it kept his flesh unwrinkled, his hair black, his mind sharp. The guards laughed about it, in the same way men laughed at the wind, half in jest, half in reverence. Jareth's body was weakening faster now. He woke each morning with an ache in his bones, and his dreams when they came were filled with the faces he had seen in the brazier's fire. Some whispered to him, though their words were drowned in the crackling roar. One night, he dreamed of a narrow stone stair spiraling downward into a pit of light. When he awoke, he found his palms curled tightly into fists, nails biting into skin, as if holding on to something that had almost slipped away. The girl began to speak to him more often, always in fragments, never when a guard might notice. Her name, she told him, was Morel. She had been taken to Winter's Past, along with her younger brother, after their village failed to pay the king's tax. The brother had been full of life, strong enough that the harness took only small measures from him at first, but strength made for a longer burn, and the warden had chosen him for the brazier when the ember feast approached. Morel said she had watched him vanish into light while the warden spoke his benediction, and since then she could not look at fire without seeing his eyes. They spoke of the fortress's layout and coded whispers, Morel, describing passages she had cleaned, Jareth recalling the rhythm of the guards' rotations. There were places, she said, where the old monastery's stones still showed beneath the later edition's archways, sealed with iron, doors that led nowhere. yet carried the scent of stale air, as if something waited on the other side. One of these doors was near the brazier chamber, set low into the wall and locked with a mechanism older than the rest of the fortress. She believed it led to the Ember Saint's original shrine. It was during the month of Ember Feast that the fortress shifted into something more terrible. Prisoners were worked harder, and the harnesses tightened without warning, pulling more lumen than before. The torches burned with unnatural clarity, and the brazier's flame grew taller, its heart no longer gold but white blue, a color that hurt to look at. At night, the halls were filled with the muffled sobs of those chosen for the full drawing. The warden's ledger filled quickly. Jareth was summoned to work in the brazier chamber again, this time alongside 2 guards and Morel. They were polishing the carved steps when he noticed the small, low door she had mentioned, half hidden behind a hanging banner, its frame etched with symbols worn smooth by centuries. The lock was a twisted knot of black iron, unlike the brass mechanisms used elsewhere. It radiated cold, even from a distance. He forced himself not to stare, but the shape of it branded itself into his mind. That night, he asked Morel if she believed the saint could be destroyed. She hesitated before answering. "If it is bound, it can be unbound," she said. "But if it dies, we may die with it. Perhaps that is mercy." The words haunted him. Death was not something he feared in the abstract. It was the manner of it that filled him with dread. To be burned into nothing, to have his very essence used as fuel for something he did not understand, that was the fate he could not accept. The following day, a prisoner from Jareth's wing was taken for the full drawing. The man had been silent for months, but as the guards led him away, he caught Jareth's eye. "Find the root," he rasped. "Cut it, and the fire will starve." Jareth did not know if the man had overheard his talks with Morel, or if it was simply the fever of imminent death speaking. But the phrase stayed with him. He began to watch the lumen tubes more closely, noting where they disappeared into the walls, how they converged near the brazier chamber. The fortress was a network of veins, all carrying life toward that single blazing heart. If the harnesses were the skin, and the tubes the arteries, then the root must lie somewhere beneath the brazier, perhaps in the shrine behind the locked door. As the Ember Feast approached its climax, the warden announced a night of illumination. All torches would burn from dusk to dawn, and a dozen prisoners would be drawn in succession to honor the saint. The thought of so much lumen pouring into the brazier made Jareth's stomach turn, but it also presented an opportunity. The guards would be occupied in the ceremony, their attention fixed on the fire. If there was ever a moment to slip away, it would be then. Morel agreed, though her eyes were distant, as if she had already seen the end of this plan. "If we reach the shrine," she said, "you must be ready. The saint will not want to die." In the final nights before the feast, Jareth could not sleep. He would lie on the cold stone, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, hearing the faint hum of lumen through the tubes in the walls. Sometimes the hum deepened into a voice, not words, but a tone that stirred something primal in him, like the sound of a vast breath inhaling. And once, just before dawn, he smelled something strange, not smoke, but the scent of burning flesh. When he opened his eyes, a torch across the corridor flickered violently, and for an instant he saw Morel's brother's face in the flame. The feast would come in 2 days, and with it, the moment when Jareth would decide whether to damn himself to the brazier, or damn whatever had lived in Black Hollow since before men knew fire. The night of the Ember Feast arrived with a stillness that felt rehearsed, as though the fortress itself was holding its breath. Even the wind that usually prowled the battlements seemed to have withdrawn. The prisoners were herded into the central hall, the air thick with the scent of pitch and the faint copper temps of lumen. Above them, the great brazier roared, casting shadows that swayed like living things against the vaulted ceiling. Jareth's harness felt tighter than usual, its pull constant, like an invisible hand testing the strength of his spine. Morel stood 3 paces ahead of him, her head lowered, her hair falling forward to hide her face. The warden, dressed in ceremonial crimson, ascended the steps to the brazier, carrying a crystal phial that pulsed faintly. He raised it to the gathered prisoners and spoke of the saint's eternal hunger, of the honor it was to be consumed in service. His voice was calm, certain, the tone of a man who had repeated these words so often that they had become truth to him. When the first prisoner was led forward for the full drawing, the tubes in the chamber seemed to throb with light. The man's scream began as a sound of terror but shifted into something else, a kind of ecstatic wail as His body stiffened, and the lumen was pulled from him in shimmering threads. The light flowed upward into the brazier, swelling the flame until it hissed. Jareth forced himself not to look away. He needed to understand the rhythm of the guards, their blind spots, the way they clustered around the ceremony like moths around a candle. By the time the fifth prisoner collapsed into a husk, the room's temperature had risen enough that sweat stung Jareth's eyes. The flame had grown taller, its blue-white core so bright it threw halos of light into the rafters. This was the moment. The guards were entirely fixated on the next victim, their backs to the edges of the chamber. Morell caught Jareth's eye, and they moved as one, slipping behind the hanging banner that concealed the low door. The lock was colder than ice under his fingers, but it did not resist the slender shard of metal he had stolen days before. As the tumblers shifted with a sound like grinding bone, the air on the other side of the door exhaled dry, stale, with the faint sweetness of something long decayed. They slipped inside and closed the door behind them. The passage was narrow and sloped downward, the walls slick with condensation despite the heat above. Faint lines of lumen tubing ran along the ceiling, glowing dimly, all converging toward a single point ahead. As they descended, the air grew heavier, and a low thrumming filled the stone around them. It was not sound so much as vibration, as though the fortress's foundation itself had a heartbeat. They emerged into a chamber unlike anything Jareth had seen before. It was circular, its walls carved with scenes of fire and sacrifice figures kneeling before a central blaze, their hands raised, their faces consumed. In the center stood a stone altar, and above it, suspended by iron chains, hung a vast mass of something that glowed faintly from within. It was not metal nor stone, but something fibrous and organic, like a great root or spinal column, twisting upon itself in a lattice of petrified sinew. From it radiated the lumen tubes, hundreds of them, each pulsing faintly as they fed into the thing. The root, as they stepped closer, the glow inside the mass brightened, and the thrumming deepened into a voice that spoke without words. Images filled Jareth's minefields of fire stretching to the horizon, a great shape descending from the sky like a burning star. The first men gathered around it in awe and terror. He saw the monks who had built the fortress above it, their faces hollowed by devotion, their hands slick with the blood of offerings. He saw the warden, young and trembling, kneeling before it as a chain was placed around his neck. Morell's breath came fast, her eyes fixed on the root. "It's alive," she whispered. "It knows we're here." Jareth stepped onto the altar. The glow within the root pulsed faster, as though in recognition. The images in his mind shifted now. He saw himself, bound in the harness, his body unraveling into light that would feed this thing for centuries. The root was showing him the inevitability of his fate, the futility of resistance. But beneath the fear was a stubborn ember. He reached for the shard of metal, now slick with sweat. "If it bleeds," he said, "it can starve." The first strike sent a shudder through the chamber, a sound like distant thunder. The glow inside the root flared white, and the lumen tubes overhead writhed as if in pain. A voice not in his mind, but in the air spoke, then, deep and resonant, every word vibrating in his bones. "I have burned since before your kind could speak. You cannot unmake the first fire." Morell grabbed another shard from the altar's edge and joined him, hacking at the fibrous mass. With each blow, the light inside it guttered, and the thrumming grew erratic. Above them, faintly, they could hear shouts. Guards had noticed the drop in the brazier's flame. The root split, with a sound like tearing cloth, and a gush of light poured from it, blinding and hot. Jareth felt it wash over him, searing his skin, filling his lungs with fire. The tubes overhead burst one by one, raining down shards of glass and sputtering lumen. The fortress above screamed. Not the people, the stones, the walls, the very air. Somewhere, the brazier's roar turned into a strangled hiss, and the heat in the chamber plummeted. Jareth fell to his knees, his vision swimming. The last thing he saw was the root collapsing inward, curling into itself like a dying flame. When he awoke, the passage was choked with smoke and dust. Morell was gone. Whether she had fled or been taken by the collapse, he could not say. He stumbled upward through the dark, emerging at last into the brazier chamber. The torches were dead. The brazier was a blackened husk, cold to the touch. Prisoners huddled in the corners unbound, their harnesses slack. The warden lay sprawled on the steps, eyes wide, skin pale as parchment. In his hand was the crystal phial, now dark and empty. Jareth walked past him without a word. Outside, the wind had returned, howling across the battlements. Black Hollow stood in silence, its hunger gone. But in the darkness beyond the walls, Jareth thought he saw a faint flicker far off, yet moving, like a spark carried on the wind. And he wondered if the first fire had truly died, or if it had simply gone in search of a new hearth.